coming to our talk. We are going to be talking about how we design and build Salesforce. I'm sure you've all seen the safe harbor slide. That applies to this talk as well. And what we have right now represented up here is R&D and UX for Salesforce. My name's Gina. I'm Senior Product Designer. We also have Ryan, Principal Product Designer. We have Paul Decoudray, who's our Creative Director. We have Sanka, who's our UX Engineering Architect. And we have John, who's a Principal UI Developer. And I always like to start with one of my favorite quotes, which is, it used to be that designers made an object and walked away. Today, the emphasis must shift to designing the entire life cycle. And that's by Paul Saffo, and I think that applies really well to what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to let Ryan have it.
Excellent. So let's talk a bit about how we designed Salesforce 1, some of the challenges that we came across during that process, and really what it's like to be a designer in an enterprise company. So designing for enterprise presents a certain set of challenges that I think that they're not necessarily unique to the space, but they're different than, say, designing a consumer app at a small company, for example. There's a different set of priorities. And so some of the things that as designers we take into account is, number one, scale and maintainability needs to be a consideration up front, right? This is typically something in a startup that you would think about down the line when you needed to. You cross the bridge when you come to it. We're already at that point, so we need to think about it up front, and not just from an engineering standpoint, but also from a design standpoint. And the ability to maintain our own design system, because let's face it, designs change all the time. And we need ways to make that manageable for our team. Also at Salesforce, we're very fortunate to have a ton of users. And as the user experience team, the designs that we propose impact literally millions of people. And this is a really unique privilege. But we also have to be pretty mindful about all the decisions that we make so that they're calculated and that they align with the goals of our users and the goals of their businesses. We also have a growing number of platforms and devices that we need to support. This list is growing every day. And tons of use cases that we need to support. I mean, this is what the platform is for, is to support all these different vertical use cases. And I think as a designer, we need to think pretty agnostically about how people might use Salesforce, because everyone's customized it in their own way to fit their business process. And speaking of that, we have billions of lines of customer code that represent customizations in the system. And so as designers, we need to take that into account. I mean, anytime that we are talking about revamping the UI in any way, we need to make sure that all that customization can come with us forward. So it presents an interesting challenge when we're trying to design the future, we're trying to innovate. We also need to make sure that we can bring everything that we've done before with us on that journey. Let's jump back to early 2013 just to set a little historical context on when we started the Salesforce 1 design journey. We, on the design team, had created a prototype of what we were envisioning would be the next version of the Chatter client for iOS and Android. And it included the ability to view records in Salesforce. And Mark really loved this idea. He pushed us on this and wanted to see us take it further, and more or less told us that he imagined this as the next Salesforce, not just the next version of Chatter. So we were off, and we assembled a team of designers and researchers, product managers, engineers, this core team of people, and we got together in the same space so that we could make decisions quickly, and it worked quite well for us. In this scenario, we were able to operate like a much smaller company because most of the stakeholders that we needed decisions from on a daily basis were in that room with us. And so as we iterated, as we found new evidence and research, all of that stuff was covered on a daily basis. So we were able to move pretty quickly through that and really avoid building up debt in indecision. I think that traditionally the way that we work, because we're separate organizations, sometimes you have a stakeholder that you need to get buy-in from on a specific design decision, and you may email them or send them a message, and they'll get back to you when they can. But having those people in the room made a really big difference for us. Also, one of our goals was to make as many decisions with this project and base them on evidence, base them on data. And so we started a pretty aggressive user research program, and a few weeks into the project, we had something like 500 data points, which was great, and we've continued that. I don't know why we're flashing. We've continued that throughout the process. And so as the project started to take more shape, we identified what our design principles were. First and foremost, we wanted to promote collaboration. This may seem like old news or last year's news, but bringing together the collaboration into the data itself, and that conversation that was happening in chatter and groups, bringing it to places like accounts and opportunities was one of our main goals. We also knew that we needed to rethink navigation because the desktop navigation paradigm of horizontal tabs across the entire screen obviously wasn't going to work on a phone. So we decided to make search a first-class citizen. And in that process, we came up with a lot of improvements to our search infrastructure that will see their way into all of the form factors. Things like zero suggest results. So without typing anything, if I tap into that search box, I'll see a list of recent items that I may not have to type anything to get to where I want, or type ahead results, for example. So these are always to just get you to your work faster. We also wanted to add personality. Our company has a ton of personality. And you can see it here at Dreamforce. You can see it in our marketing. You can see it in Mark, our CEO. And so we wanted to bring that back to the product. So I think what becomes interesting is that as the project progressed and we got more confident with the design itself, now we suddenly had to communicate this out to the rest of the organization and build it. And that's what we're going to spend most of the time talking about after this. But really, we're trying to answer this question of how do you communicate design across a large organization successfully?
Hello. So still in the problem part of this presentation, for Salesforce One, when we were delivering the design for the first time around, this was our main question. How do we communicate design? We started getting all kinds of questions like, where can I find the icons? What color is the button? Where can I find the icons? And at Salesforce, we have multiple engineering teams, and we have multiple Scrum teams, and so we got these questions from multiple places. So how do we service and how do we create a set of documentation we can use across these teams? The red lines became a bit of a nightmare. If you don't know what a red line is, it's our term for a spec. So on a screen, you would want to delineate sizing, spacing, color. And if you think about over 80 unique screens within Salesforce One on mobile, and then as we're moving into this year on tablet and desktop, you have multiple devices, you have multiple platforms. It's almost unattainable to actually achieve 100% perfect spec for your design where you could say, oh, everything is up there, it's perfect, it's done. We did all 50,000 devices, and we'll be in Hawaii for the next year. Just page me. And besides being a scaling problem, the fact that we actually couldn't do that, I feel like it really takes, if you look at a release cycle, it makes, you're designing in the first half, and then the second half, you're basically spending the whole time on documentation, which takes the momentum out of the design process and puts you in a different mode altogether. Besides it being a little bit demoralizing to spend a week, and at the end of that week, you finish the whole thing, and the moment you turn it in, it's completely obsolete. That I think the fundamental problem that I feel like we were trying to solve for throughout the next year after releasing Salesforce 1 is that when you treat design as a deliverable like that, you're building up a fundamental resistance to change within the organization, and that's precisely what we didn't want to do as product designers. I mean, even if you think about research, design, and engineering, all of these teams are working together to respond to new research, to actually using the design on a prototype, to actually experiencing technical limitations you didn't think about in the code, and then getting to our users and hearing their feedback. When it's in production, that whole system should be set up to actually respond to the design, not say, oh, it's done, and then why did it change? We kept getting that question, why do designs keep changing? And I think we're trying to turn that over on itself and say it's going to be changing every single day. That's what it's about. So we are trying to move away from designing pages at this point to designing systems. So Zonka is going to talk about the solution wrapped up inside that.
Great, thank you. So the challenge we face is that, and maybe first with the question, how do we keep colors, spacing, sizes, etc. consistent? So when you think about it, Salesforce 1, we have got multiple code bases which are for different platforms, iOS, Android, the web, and it's quite a challenge to keep the design really consistent across the board. Meaning if the font size on like Android is 16 pixels, it has to be the same size on the other platforms as well. And to manage this has been historically quite a challenge, let's put it that way. We were looking for a solution to this problem, and we came up with what we call the single source of truth, which means we have got one central place where we manage what we call design properties, and then we developed a system, or like a tool chain, better said, which actually translates these design properties into what's natural to the various platforms. Let me show you a graphic how that looks like. So the UX team, we actually creating design properties and then also assets. John is actually, I think Gina is actually talking about the assets part. We are defining these design properties, which are font sizes, colors, spacings, border colors, border thickness, font faces, pretty much everything which you can define in a numeric way, or like in a concrete way. And then, as I said, we actually translate it down to the various platforms, being Android, iOS, and Windows 8. And then here, I think we are also missing the web. But so it's like for like native and web. The tool which we actually developed to solve this is called Theo. Oh.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, it is. Yep. Sorry about that. So Theo is a tool which takes our raw format, which is actually JSON data, and then translates it into the various. Here you see the CSS preprocessors like Sass, and Stylus. It also translates it into Lightning, our Salesforce web framework, and the native platforms being iOS, Android, and also Windows 8 is missing here. Plus, it also has the capability to generate a style guide at the same time, which means when you want to change a color, you change it in one place, you run the tool, and it then generates these formats. And when you make this whole thing part of the build process, designers can change these design properties pretty much till the end of the development cycle, and developers don't really care about the impact. So when you like when you think about software development, usually there's like a design freeze and a development freeze at some point. And with this system, designers can keep working until feature freeze and not until design freeze, which gives them more time, which is great. Let me show you an example. For SAS. SAS is a CSS preprocessor for the web. It's very popular. As I said, our raw JSON data could look like this. So the text color in this case is 444. We also add some metadata for the style guide, which is being generated out of it. It's actually very important because otherwise, I don't have the number, but I think we've got about 200 design properties for Salesforce 1 and probably like 30, 40 different colors, and you need them documented to make sure that you know when to use what. We've got semantic names, but still some comments are very helpful. So you see the like raw data on top, and on the bottom the SAS output, and you just have to imagine like 200 properties, and then they actually translate to 200 SAS properties. On the iOS platform, the example would be like that. It would generate just a name-value pair, and the native developer would then like reference to that variable when coding the text color. The style guide, this is just an example that it will create this snippet for the documentation. You will actually see like a screenshot of the style guide in a little bit. I think John will show it. So the whole challenge is to take this raw data, and what Theo does, it is translating, for instance, when it comes to colors, it creates like hex values for CSS. iOS likes to use RGBA. On the Android platform, there's something which I just learned about actually when we were coding Theo. They're using 8-digit hex values. It's native to like other platform, and the good thing is we deal with it, and the designer just has to worry about the raw data, and the developer knows exactly what to use. Another example would be spacings and font sizes. We specify in rem or in pixel in the raw data, and for CSS we can still use rem, ems, or pixels. On the native platforms it's a little bit different, and Theo has the capabilities to actually translate it to points on the iOS platform or to SP and DIP, which are scalable independent pixels and device independent pixels. With that, I will hand over to John.
Thanks, Sanka. So my other colleagues up here represent user experience, and I sort of represent the engineering side of things. So historically at Salesforce, we could have been better at collaborating between the two teams, and thanks to these fine people up here and others and the tools we've built together, we're a lot better at that now. So as Sanka just explained in pretty good detail, we know there's no longer hard-coded values throughout. I'll speak from the web side of things, in our CSS for Salesforce 1. Again, historically, designers wouldn't often communicate with each other, and they'd send designs over to development teams, and oftentimes there'd be subtle differences between in colors and font sizes and such. And so by having a single source of truth, we've removed the proliferation of inconsistent styles. So going back to the red lines, we're delivered a ton of these red lines for various features. And if I drill into one, now we specify things such as spacing and the font sizes and colors and something we didn't touch on, media queries. So the sizing is uniform throughout across the different devices and across products. We specify those in terms of the theme tokens, or the design properties, I should say, as they're called now. So again, things like colors and gradients, font sizes and faces, borders, border colors, spacing, margin and padding. Oop,
Yeah, you're fine.
we're good. So here's a sampling of some of the colors that we've defined that represent different elements, and we get to refer to them now by name instead of the hex values, and have run into problems in various places. So how do we make future design changes easier? Well, as the others have discussed, they design right up until feature freeze in many cases. And of course, developers begin much before that, and we can't just wait until the design is finished to begin coding. So we're able to code with the design as it stands on a given day. And now that the properties have been pulled back into the ownership of UX, we're able to make those sweeping changes in one place without having to go reach out to dozens and hundreds of developers and say, we need this color changed here, this color changed there. So the system works. Excuse me, the system works. An example of that is that towards the end of every release, I usually receive a document that's a global set of changes that we want to see in that release, and it's late changes, basically, to how the look and feel of things. This particular, most recent release, it was a lot more thorough, or a lot more involved than in previous ones, but it actually took me almost no time. I had to change virtually zero CSS. It was just essentially in their hands to update the tokens, generate a new one, and I checked it in, and it's done, essentially. A quick note on accessibility and how this affects accessibility. So we're very proud here that all of the products we build are accessible to individuals with various disabilities. And we have all sorts of tests in place and processes that ensure that. One of those being like a color contrast test. Oftentimes, sometimes the design slips through the cracks that the color contrast is off and doesn't pass that test, and we don't actually realize that until we've built the feature and the test fails. So we're able to just kind of go back to UX and say, this failed for such and such a reason. Can we have other colors that pass that test? And lickety-split that, we just tweak a value, and then check in the new token file, and the test passed for all consumers of that particular component. So it's been really effective there. And with that, I pass it back to...
You can just hold it. I've got this one.
Got a mic.
That's really awesome to hear. So our system also covers assets. We have a lot of assets, a lot of icons, and of course different platforms take these assets in a different way. So we store all our assets in a repository in an SVG format. And one of the cool things we've done is we actually have these assets displaying in our style guide automatically. It's also really helpful for distributing assets internally. So here's an example of the style guide with some of our assets. And when the designers are creating these icons, it's really difficult to create several versions of these icons for all the different sizes needed. So we have another tool that we built called Blender, and it basically takes SVGs and it rasterizes them as a fallback. And so for Android, you have like your 4 different sizes. iOS, you have your 3 different sizes. Soon we'll be doing it for Windows as well. And of course, the different sizes we might need for web. But from the designer's perspective, like saving out all these assets is a lot of work. We don't have to do that anymore. We just save them in a repository, and those assets get created. So style guides are really common right now. A lot of companies are doing them and putting them public, which is really awesome. I really encourage creating a living style guide. This is an example of our style guide. It's actually public. You can check it out at this URL. We publish this every release. So every time you see the style guide, it's what represents our app currently. One thing I want to note is that the moment that style guides are no longer current, they're no longer useful. And so it's really important to try to create a design system that promotes maintainability and persists as a living documentation. Our style guide also shows some of our components that are in our web application, or our application. And when we update it here, we know that it's going to be updated throughout our prototypes that we build on. And we prefer using the prototypes as a spec versus the red lines. And we have all of this generated from the documentation that we mentioned before. So like the colors, and you know how we were talking about using Theo to document all those colors, and it propagates throughout the entire system. That's including the style guide as well. So a change in one place changes everywhere. And it allows us to have truer consistency. And this is like a really awesome thing for a project on this scale. It's really massive. We have a Medium post on this in case you're curious and want to read up a little bit more about the tools that we built. And Sanka wrote this post. I recommend reading it later. It kind of explains like what we did. And I also want to leave on another one of my favorite quotes. And then we'll take some questions. But it's be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work. I really like this. I really like this quote because it's sort of like how I like to think about like designing. You know, earlier I had the quote about not just designing the object, but designing the entire life cycle. The more time you spend working on trying to maintain all these red lines and all these specs, the less time you have to really create awesome products. But the more time you kind of like get orderly, get this stuff together, you have way more time to create awesome things. So that's, that's one thing I like to think about. And I just want to mention, we do have a Twitter account in case you want to keep up with what we're doing at Salesforce UX, and we're also on Dribble at Salesforce. And now if we have time for questions, do we have time for questions? Awesome, cool, and thank you. So. Any questions? Anyone? Yes.
Does the system make it easier to perhaps bring?
Want to repeat the question?
Hello, is it on? Yeah. So yeah, the system, so I'll speak from the Lightning or web side of things. So we generate, the tool Theo generates theme. Oh, sorry. The question was, does the system provide a way to generate themes or different skins, I guess you'd say, for a product line? Yeah, so from the web side of things, we generate theme files. That's what Lightning consumes. And it's the entire set of tokens for a given theme for a given product. And we can have multiple. We currently only have one for Salesforce 1, but yes, from the web side of things we can. I can't speak to the native for the native side of things, but I'm sure we can do something similar, right?
Yes, you could do the same. You would just generate like multiple theme files. Then like in this case, you would call them, and then the like native developer, for instance, would point to one or the other file. And since the whole UI is completely dynamic, it would pick up the right colors and font sizes and whatever belongs to that theme.
Any other questions? Yes.
To what extent can I use this to build my own style tools without
The question is if the tool is actually public, and yes, it is. It is public and it's open source. It is under github.com/salesforce-ux/Theo, and we just open sourced it I think a couple of months ago, and we are looking forward to get also contributions to it. So it works for us, and we hope that it's working also because it's solving like an industry problem. Have like a single source of truth, and then have it work against all the different platforms. Does it answer your question? Thanks.
Yeah. So.
Please excuse me. Yes, it is github.com/salesforce-ux/Theo, THEO.
So with the Lightning, we can get the components built by different companies, right?
So how do we get our own style guide for all these components? I mean, do we get anything out of the box, or we have to create our own style guide and change all the CSS?
I can take that one. So when we initially created our living style guide that we showed earlier, it was to solve an internal problem that we had, but we did make it public because we were very proud of it. And we didn't anticipate the need that people had for this as well. So we are going to be building a framework that you can use. It's not out yet, but we are building one. But it'll basically be like all the different components, sort of like a bootstrap-like framework that you can use.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.